The Julian Assange extradition hearing is now being held in Great Britain. Join Richard Ebeling and me in this week's segment of the Libertarian Angle as we discuss the persecution of Julian Assange. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, President of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the principled case for libertarianism. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, Professor of Economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again after a week off there here at Libertarian Angle.
Good to be back here with you and with our viewers and listeners to deal with these important issues of the day.
Yeah, and one of the important issues of the day is what's going on with Julian Assange. I mean, you know, Richard, this has got to be one of the most sordid things that's going on in the country today, along with, of course, all the pandemic nonsense, the tyranny and stuff. But I mean, what they've done to this guy is an absolute travesty. Assange, of course, is head of WikiLeaks, and you know what's his crime? And I put crime in quotation marks. That he disclosed the truth about the evil acts of the national security state. And you see that's a cardinal sin in any national security state, that the CIA and the Pentagon, the NSA, they hold the position that we have our dark side secrets. We have to do these dark side things to protect national security, which is, of course, this ridiculous, meaningless term that has no objective meaning. Nobody's ever defined it. And they have carte blanche to do whatever they want. Long ago, the federal courts deferred to them that as long as you say it's in national security, we're not going to interfere with you. So you've got assassinations, you've got coups, kidnappings, torture, executions. I mean, all kinds of sort of things that you see in other national security states like North Korea and Cuba and Russia and China. But the cardinal sin is you don't talk about these things. They have to be kept secret from the citizenry. Well, this is ridiculous. I mean, that's what they're going after Assange for, with a vengeance. And by the way, it's the same thing with Snowden, Edward Snowden. I mean, the other, the third part of the national security establishment, the NSA's, targeted him, well, the CIA as well, because both these men told the truth. That's all. They're not saying, hey, you made this up, or you lied, you defamed us. No. They're saying you told the truth about what we did, and now we are coming after you with a vengeance. Now, with Snowden, of course, he's an American citizen, so they're going after him on ridiculous charge of treason. Interestingly enough, as an aside, President Trump is threatening to pardon him, but boy, I'm sure he knows the risks he takes in doing that with the national security state. But with Assange, he's not an American citizen. He's an Australian, so they can't get him on treason. You know, why wouldn't an Australian be guilty of treason against the U.S. government? So what they've done is they've gone off on this obscure espionage law from World War I, if you can believe that. Now here is this horrific war, this intervention that cost the lives of tens of thousands of American soldiers for nothing. They accomplished absolutely nothing. Oh, yeah, they defeated Germany, but the war was to make the world safe for democracy and make it the war to end all wars. And within a short period of time, you had the rise of Hitler and World War II. So World War I accomplished nothing. But they had this so-called Espionage Act, along with the Sedition Act, whose only purpose was to suppress dissent, because there were people, Americans, who were objecting to this. I mean, this went contrary to America's heritage of non-foreign intervention. And so they passed this stupid espionage law that they kept on the books. And that's what they're going after. I mean, this stupid law that goes back to a crooked, corrupt, evil, immoral war. And they're saying, well, Assange was spying on us in some perverted way. But let me make my final point here is that it's not just what they've done to Assange. I mean, what they've done, what they caused him to hide up in the I think it was the Bolivian embassy there, for
Ecuadorian
embassy for 8 or 9 years or something. and now they've got him in a dungeon there in Great Britain. I mean, they're really treating him like he's guilty. I mean, so much for the old concept of presumption of innocence. This guy is not being treated as an innocent man. He's being treated like he's guilty, and they this is what's really going on here. I mean, they know they could lose the case against him, but what they're doing is using him as an example. They're sending out a message to everybody that says, don't even think about going down the same road, because if you do, this is what you lies in store for you. This is what we will do to you if you dare reveal our dark side, sordid, evil, immoral actions. What do you think, Richard?
Well, it's often said that the first casualty of war is a free press, because once there is a war, there's a presumption that government needs to have its national security to preserve secrets concerning military campaigns, political and diplomatic strategies against the, quote, enemy nation, unquote, and that therefore the press is censored, members of the press are threatened and intimidated into silence, or only reporting what the government wants to be known by the public. But we've had 2 world wars in the last century. And after each of these 2 world wars, there began to be emerging a form of revisionist history, that is, against the official government version of events. After World War I, there was an expose based upon archival documents that the war had a beginning that had nothing to do with just Germany being evil. Doesn't deny the fact that Germany was an imperial power. It had its own expansionist purposes and designs. But the image that Britain and France were these innocent victims just protecting democracy, when they themselves, during the midst of the war, planning their own plundering of more imperialism territories, particularly in the Middle East and German colonies in Africa and so on. And that the British had used a propaganda campaign to draw the United States into the war surreptitiously, attempting to influence public opinion in America in the years leading up to America's participation in the First World War. And then after the Second World War, even though it was a more heated and emotional time because of the emerging Cold War, there was a World War II revisionism about the Neutrality Acts of the 1930s, about Franklin Roosevelt's attempt to get around the very Neutrality Acts that he often was the signator to after Congress had passed them, to basically get the United States into a war in Europe on the British side, and to instigate a conflict with the Japanese in the Pacific as a backdoor to war, as one book about this talks about. But there was this idea that the truth comes out, that the court version of history needs to be debunked and challenged, because politicians, in spite of their rhetoric, do not always have the interests of the society at heart, the interests of their citizens at heart. They have their own either narrowly political or ideological agendas, which require making the citizens of their respective countries be the cannon fodder of their ambitions. Now, we've seen this again following or during the Vietnam War. The Pentagon Papers were released. The United States government tried to suppress it, but the New York Times had already basically been publishing it. It soon came out as a book form. So the machinations and the intrigues of American military and political strategy during the Vietnam War years, that was very different than the official version that especially the Johnson administration had attempted to convey to the American public, was debunked and challenged. So there is a long history here, just in the history of the United States, of attempts by those who are outside of the government, the media, the press, the journalist groups, to question those in political power as part of the attempt to preserve a free society, an open society, if you will, a truthful society, when everyone knows that politics is often corrupt and manipulative. So now we have this very popular and widely read and influential website, WikiLeaks, which Assange was the originator and director of. And he decided to do this telling the truth, and not just about the United States. There were documents about European countries, about the Chinese, about the Russians. He was an equal opportunity muckraker about the deceptions of governments. But he decided to take advantage of accesses of sources to tell the unofficial versions of what was going on in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in other parts of the Middle East, and American foreign policy in general. And the United States government taking the attitude that we are perpetually at war. So you notice the examples that I used before. World War I, it's over, and then the historians challenge the official history. World War II, it's over. Historians challenge the government's official propaganda version of history. But particularly since the Cold War and after, there is no end to war. In the eyes of a certain group of political class in Washington, D.C., and among the mindset of many of those who are the leading figures in the Pentagon, America is in a perpetual war. There are enemies always out there in every part of the world. And even if it seems to involve a calmness and a stability for a period of time, at any moment in some part of the world, an ideology, a terrorist group, a political fanatic, a country that the U.S. views as important in its geopolitical interest, suddenly arises and threatens this image of America's national interest. So America is in a tacit perpetual war. Most Americans, I'm not defending this, but most Americans say, well, if you're at war, during the war, you don't release information about troop movements and that type of thing. But when the war is over, certainly history should be open to objective evaluation and interpretation. But the problem is, how do you have a respite, a period after a conflict, when that which the government has attempted to influence us with is challenged based upon the facts themselves when archives are opened, or those who participated now are willing to speak the truth when they have left the political arena? Now, there is no end to this war. We are in a perpetual war for perpetual American national interest. So for Snowden to do this, or Julian Assange to do this, they are viewed as enemy combatants because there's no end to this war. There's no end to the conflict. And then historians can sort of attempt to let the chips fall where they may based upon truth and evidence. And given this mindset of a perpetual war that never ends, because somewhere at some time, either now or in the future, there could be an enemy, and America must be in a combative readiness to quench it. Otherwise, America is threatened. It means that from their point of view, any release of information, any leak, any admission of a truth through an unofficial source is a threat to the existence of the country and its national interest. And that explains part, in my view, as to why they've gone against these people, why they're insisting upon setting an example of them. Because as far as they're concerned, America is at war and will always be at war, and therefore there can only be one official version of the events, that which serves the interests of those in political power as they see the concerns and objectives of the day. And so if they can make an example of Assange and never letting Snowden come back, or if they could capture him, putting him on trial for treason, releasing these documents and putting away in a dark, isolated dungeon for the rest of his life, they will be doing so because they believe that they're right, and they want to set an example that no one dares to do it again.
Yeah, that's a fascinating analysis, because when you go back to the Cold War period, which was when the federal government got converted to a national security state. I mean, that was the very reason the government got converted to a national security state. And I should point out that a national security state is contrary to the principles of a free society. North Korea is a national security state. Russia, China, Cuba, North Korea, they're all Egypt, all national security states. And what the things that distinguish a national security state are omnipotent powers. That you've got a section of government that can do whatever it wants. So the concept of limited government is ridiculous. because, people will say, oh, well, look, the DEA is limited in its powers, or the Immigration Service is limited, and the Secret Service is limited. But as long as you have one major aspect of government that has unlimited powers, that government is unlimited, because they can assassinate, they can have regime change operations, coups, kidnappings, bribery, and nobody can interfere with them. And the federal courts have already made it clear that their power, for example, of assassinating Americans is an omnipotent power. And so that was what the bin Laden case was all about. So during the Cold War, when you had these secrets, the idea was that the Cold War was going to go on forever, that the war against communism, that there were communists everywhere, and until the last communist was wiped out, we had to be on our guard. And so anybody that released secrets was a traitor. I mean, that's what the whole Daniel Ellsberg case was all about, that he was releasing information in a war that was supposed to be stopping the communists and stopping the dominoes from falling and so forth. But, one of the fascinating aspects of this national security concept is that every time these secrets are released, nothing happens. I mean, look, all of Snowden's records that got released, they said, oh, that was a threat to national security. Really, what happened? Did the U.S. fall into the ocean? Did the communists take over? Did the terrorists take over? Same with Daniel Ellsberg. Every time there's been this release and they claim threat to national security, nothing ever happens. The most they're ever able to say is, oh, well, our assassins overseas might get executed. Well, yeah, maybe you shouldn't be assassinating people overseas. Maybe you need to, rid yourself of a governmental apparatus that has assassins. But once the Cold War was over, well, okay, that was the time for what you're saying, the revisionist history time. Let's start opening things up. But very quickly, they went into the Middle East. They started provoking trouble, poking hornets' nests, invading Iraq, Persian Gulf War, sanctions, killing multitudes of Iraqi children, the unconditional aid to the Israeli regime, the no-fly zones, the troops near Mecca and Medina, the holiest lands in the Muslim religion. So you end up with terrorist attacks like the USS Cole, the embassies in East Africa, the 9/11 attacks, and then later the Detroit would-be bomber and the Fort Hood killer, and it's all oriented toward this, like you point out, this perpetual war on terrorism. I mean, this is a better racket than the Cold War, because presumably, I mean, the Cold War could end. The war on terrorism is endless. And I pointed this out at the very beginning after 9/11. I said, when they were talking about, well, this is going to take a long time to wipe out all the terrorists. Well, duh, especially when you've got a foreign policy that is designed to wipe out the terrorists that produces more terrorists. It's a perpetual machine where they produce an endless supply of terrorists simply by going over there to kill terrorists. And of course, it's always suspected terrorists that they're killing. I mean, one of the documents that Assange released was videos was this video of a helicopter gunship shooting people there in Iraq that were like unarmed. And the helicopter pilots are acting just sort of indifferent to what's going on. And people came to help them. They shoot them up. I mean, it was an incredible video. I mean, but it reveals that what happens in these kind of interventions in war is you develop this callousness where they're all terrorists or they're all communists. And it's not what this country should be all about. It's just, that's not what America's all about. And that's why I've continually argued here at FFF that to strike the root, you got to restore a limited government republic. It's not enough to rein in the CIA or disclose their wrongdoing and hope they reform, or the Pentagon. You've got to restore a limited government republic. You've got to get rid of this national security state apparatus. There's really no other solution to this. I mean, and that's one of the things that's been disappointing about Snowden. I mean, Snowden did this heroic act of revealing all this, and really he risked his life, because if they did, you mentioned the bringing him back and putting him in a dungeon or keeping him in Russia. Well, another possibility is assassination. And I have no doubts that if they had the opportunity to assassinate Snowden, they'd take it. But this is what a national security state does. It perverts moral values. It perverts ethical values. These people are heroic. Snowden and Assange should be celebrated in every school across America for just having the courage to risk their lives and their occupations and their fortunes, their liberty, to disclose the truth to the American people about these sordid dark side practices. And instead, you've got this mindset of, oh, they're bad people. We have to do something about them.
Yeah, let's take the case of our current president, Trump. When he was running for president 4 years ago, he publicly said that WikiLeaks was wonderful. Why was WikiLeaks wonderful? Because it had released information about the insides of the Democratic Party and Hillary Clinton. But once he becomes president, in spite of the fact that he's thrown out this bone of rhetoric about pardoning Snowden, immediately he's commander in chief. He now has a different mindset. And that mindset is nobody must say or tell anything other than what the government wants. You were saying that they should be viewed as heroes. The fact is that if you believe in a free society, and that while it may be the case that some agency must exist to secure people's rights to their life, liberty, and property against the aggressions of others, that is a minimal government. As the founding fathers understood, and an insight that we have increasingly basically left far behind us in our mindsets, is that no matter how much you may say that a government in some minimal sense is essential for the protection and the preservation of liberty and property, contract, and so on, it is always a potential threat to the very liberty that it is supposedly established to secure and defend. As a consequence of this, you need to have a perpetual suspicion. You talk about perpetual national security state. The citizen must have a perpetual suspicion, doubt, hesitancy to ever take anything that those in government say at face value. You must always believe that there's something ulterior there, because precisely because they have the monopoly control of force, can be used against the very citizens that they claim to be the servants for. So as a consequence, when any person reveals such truths, such as Snowden did, as Assange through WikiLeaks has done, whenever such people speak such truths, one should view them as protectors of liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of self-government, freedom of a free society, rather than the enemy. See, this is one of the most shocking and disturbing aspects of this. There's an old Sherlock Holmes story, I forget which one it is, in which Sherlock Holmes says the thing that stands out most is that the dog didn't bark. Okay, he's trying to investigate how some murder occurred, and there was a watchdog. The thing that stands out most is that the dog didn't bark. Well, the government is doing things that are against the long-term sustainability of liberty and limited government in these types of foreign adventures. But what we have is that when their exposés are offered to the American people, what stands out? The dog didn't bark. The silence from the general public. Now, have there been defenders of Snowden and Assange? Certainly. Some on the left, some on the right, some in the middle. So there have been some defenders of both of them in the idea to tell the truth. But what is most disturbing is that even with a rather well-done movie about Snowden a couple of 3 years ago, which was in the theaters, the fact is that most Americans are silent about this. And by their very silence, they're demonstrating their loss of justifiable doubt and suspicion about government, and a misplaced loyalty that if government says something, it must be true, it must be trusted, and it must not be challenged. That is a dangerous mindset for the institutional preservation of a free society.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned freedom of speech. One of the interesting aspects of this controversy is the Pentagon's and the CIA's and the Justice Department's position that WikiLeaks isn't a true newspaper or a true media outlet, and that their claim is that the First Amendment protects only legitimate journalistic outlets, and that WikiLeaks is just a website. Well, this is a ridiculous distinction. I mean, why does the issue even arise of who's a newspaper and who's a website? As far as I'm concerned, anybody's got the right to disclose the evil, immoral actions of his own government, or any government for that matter. I mean, it's just that's just a basic thing about being a human being. You come across dark side secrets, you got a right to reveal them. I don't care how upset they get. You don't have to be a journalist. You don't have to be a newspaper. So this notion that WikiLeaks isn't a real newspaper, I think is just a real red herring. You know, they're just grasping at straws. But what's so fascinating to me in this whole thing, Richard, is the thirst for vengeance here. I saw this once before in a case involving Iraq, where, as you'll recall, they had the brutal sanctions against the Iraqi people for some 11 years that was killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children. And there were three high UN officials who resigned out of a crisis of conscience. They just said, we can't participate in this. And they couldn't stop it because the U.S. was too powerful. And I think the guy's name was von Sponek, and another guy's name was Butler, I think, and there was a woman. But they resigned and said, look, we're not going to participate in this. Well, there was a guy from Seattle named Bert Sachs that said to heck with them, and he started taking in medicines and other assistance to the Iraqi people because these children were just dying in mass from polluted waters and so forth because of these sanctions, and because the Pentagon had destroyed all the water and sewage treatment plants during the Persian Gulf War on purpose, knowing that they would spread these infectious illnesses. Well, they went after Sachs with a vengeance, the same vengeance that they took that they're taking against Snowden and Assange. They fined him $10,000, which in the larger scheme is pretty minor, but to Sachs's everlasting credit, he refused to pay it, and he fought them and fought them and fought them like for 10 years. He kept dragging his feet, taking it to court, and finally ended up wearing them down and ended up winning, where he didn't have to pay them a dime. But what I found fascinating was the vengeance to go after a guy continuously for like 10 years or so because he had violated their rule against helping the Iraqi people. And that's that same vengeance that they're going with Assange, man. The fact that he revealed their secrets, boy, that's just the unforgivable sin. And the way they're treating him in this dungeon in Great Britain, you know, where they're exposing him, where he's been exposed to the coronavirus. I don't think he's caught it, but his mental health is bad. His physical health is bad. This is all by design, as far as I'm concerned. They're just trying to wear him out. And if they could kill him or have him die of supposed natural causes before he got to the United States, I think they would be ecstatic, because then they could go and tell everybody else, this is what's going to happen to you if you reveal our secrets.
Yeah, this again can be looked at in sort of even a broader canvas, perhaps. And this is just typical of the central planning mentality. They, in political charge, know what people should believe, how people should act, what they should know, how they should show their loyalty, and what they will be punished for and how if they challenge those that have set the national security agenda, goals, and purposes. It's just a center of political paternalism combined with a central planning mentality. We know what's best. We know what the children's citizens should know, and we're going to punish Johnny Citizen if he does anything that is not appropriate as we see it for the good of everybody in the country, because we're the elite. And what you see, and this needs to be kept in mind too. It doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats. They may argue over the content and the direction of foreign policy, often idealism versus realism, pragmatism versus their idea of a principle, human rights or something. But regardless of their differences of what form the foreign intervention, political, economic, and military should take, they all accept the idea that there has to be a chosen elect who know more, understand more, see further into the future than the ordinary citizen. And it is their duty and responsibility to see that the people follow and obey and acquiesce, because otherwise America on the global scene could be doomed. That's a dangerous mentality in itself. Adam Smith says somewhere in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations, nowhere is such political control more dangerous than in the hands of a man who has the arrogance and folly to believe that he has the knowledge and wisdom to use it.
I couldn't agree with you more, but I would put the real problem of the major central planners right squarely under the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the CIA, and the NSA. And I want to make reference to a fantastic book, highly recommend it to people, called Double Government by a man named Michael Glennon. Now, Glennon is not just some obscure guy that wrote this book. He is a professor of law at Tufts University. He has served as counsel for Senate subcommittees and so forth. The guy's got a lot of prestige. Glennon's thesis makes a lot of sense. He says that the real power of this government, the federal government, lies with the national security branch of the government, the Pentagon, the CIA, and the NSA. That they're the ones really running the show. But they let the other three branches have a veneer that they're in control, the Supreme Court, Congress, the president. They let them have the veneer that they're in charge because they don't care about the veneer. What they care about is the reality of the power. And that this is why that when push comes to shove, it's the generals and the CIA officials and the NSA officials who are the central planners, who are looking across the world and saying, this is what we need to do. This is why we need to do it. And usually, Congress defers, the Supreme Court defers, the president defers. Sometimes there might be a conflict, in which case the national security branch might let them look like they're in charge. But I think Glennon's spot on. I think the real power that I forget who said it. I think it was George Washington that said, government is force. And the real force of this government lies with the military, the CIA, and the NSA. That's where you've got the military, the armaments, the assassination powers, the spying powers. I think that's where your central planning is really taking place.
I rarely like to say a good word about Donald Trump, but as many of the viewers and listeners may know, he recently was reported to have said that the problem is with the people in the Pentagon is that all they care about are fighting their foreign wars and satisfying the contractors who feed the war machine. What was it? Oh, shock. You mean the military brass has their own interest that they're pursuing, or that they serve and pander to special interest groups that eat at the trough of the state? And now you had the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff go public. We only care for the national interest. We're serving the safety of the country. I'm shocked that even a president of the United States should accuse us of having baser motives and more narrow goals and purposes in mind. It touched a raw nerve. Because normally those in the military, right, to civilian leadership over the military, rarely do they make such public rebukes against, especially a sitting president.
Yeah, Trump can make some interesting comments. I mean, when he suggested that he's considering pardoning Snowden, I mean, that had to have set off all kinds of alarm bells in the CIA and the NSA and the CIA, Pentagon. I mean, that's not what a president's supposed to do. This is a traitor in the eyes of the national security state. And you reminded me of that great book by, Smedley, Smedley Butler, is that what his name was? The War is a Racket,
Yeah.
where he says, I went into Latin America in the military and supposedly fight for America, and at the end of it, I realized all I was doing was over there to protect the corporate interests of the Wall Street thugs.
Well, because some viewers may know the name John T. Flynn. He was a classical liberal, libertarian-oriented journalist, author, and he wrote an article in 1937 called "Making the World Safe for Standard Oil." And the theme was that the Japanese had invaded China in 1937. They were marching up the Yangtze River, having landed main forces in central China near Shanghai, marching up to the Chinese capital of Nanking. And along the way, they ended up bombing with airplanes a U.S. gunboat, the Panay. Now, what is a U.S. gunboat doing on the Yangtze River? First of all, it's China. It's not U.S. waters, and it's an armed gunboat. And it turns out that they were escorting tankers of of Standard Oil. Yeah, the U.S. the military in the territory of another country escorting the tankers of a private company. And why? To make the world safe for Standard Oil. So this is something that has gone on for quite a while.
Yeah, Flynn is a heroic guy. Why don't you tell us a little bit about his books? Just to enumerate them as they go marching, or.
Well, he has several books that I would highly recommend to our viewers and listeners. One of the best ones is called The Roosevelt Myth. It went through a couple of revised editions into the 1950s. And what it is, it's one of the best non-congratulatory biographies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. It seemed Franklin Roosevelt as an enemy of liberty and not a protector of liberty. Then another work of his, which came out during World War II in 1943 or 44, is called As We Go Marching. And it's about the trend of political ideas and practices. And he distinguishes in the book the bad fascism and the good fascism. The bad fascists are those Nazis and Italians. But then there's the good fascism. And that's the United States, with executive arbitrary authority, the concentration of power, the ignoring of the Constitution, the economic domination of the marketplace by economic controls and regulations and planning. So he was a great critic of the New Deal mentality, both Roosevelt the man, and therefore the implementer of policies during his long term as president, but also the ideology of America being fleeced of its constitutional limits and guardship of liberty. And then there's another very good little book of his, came out in 1955, I think, called The Rise and Fall of the American Republic. And in this book, he explains how America was born in the idea of liberty and what that meant in practice, and even with the imperfections and the contradictions and the pimples and the warts, that this was the core. America based upon liberty, limited government, and decentralized political authority through federalism. And how in the 20th century, up until the time when he was writing this book in around 1955, it has been weakened and weakened further and further until we are increasingly no longer the American Republic, but a new America based upon a centralized authoritarian mindset in Washington, D.C. Now, he has a number of other books, and there's some collections of his essays, but certainly The Roosevelt Myth, As We Go Marching, and the Rise and Decline of the American Republic are three worth someone taking a look at.
Yeah, I greatly benefited from John T. Flynn's books. So on that excellent note, Richard, we'll wrap things up. Thank you all for tuning in. Thanks for your great support. Come and visit us at fff.org. We got 30 years worth of principal arguments on libertarianism, both on foreign policy and domestic policy. And then subscribe to our YouTube channel. And Richard, enjoyed the conversation and look forward to talking to you next week.
Absolutely. Until next time.